Thank you so much, Matt. And thank you all so much for joining us for the New Directions in 19th Century Medievalism Studies Roundtable. We have four fantastic speakers for you today that are going to be sharing their innovative research in medievalism studies. We'll get to see how they're applying transnational frameworks as well as engaging fields like post-colonial studies and ethnic studies. And so we'll get to hear about their exciting work and think about how we can continue this trajectory in our own research, ideally. So I'm Vanessa Iacocca, Assistant Professor of English at Young Harris College, and I'll be introducing our speakers one by one before their presentations, and we'll hold questions until all of them have presented for a Q&A period for all four of them. There's a Q&A box where you can type in your questions into Zoom, so you can do that as presenters are presenting, or you can wait until that Q&A period and do the raise hand function. So please hold your out loud questions until that Q&A period, but don't hold your applause between these presentations. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce our first speaker. Dr. Kavita Mudan Finn is an independent scholar who's published widely on medieval and early modern literature, Shakespeare, popular medievalism, and fan reception studies. She's published two books, The Last Plantagenet Consorts, Gender, Genre, and Historiography, 1440 to 1627, and Global Medievalism, an Introduction, co-authored with Helen Young. Her work has also appeared in Viator, Shakespeare, Medieval and Renaissance Drama in England, Arthuriana, Critical Survey, the Journal of Fandom Studies, Quarterly Review of Film and Video, and a range of edited volumes. She works as a freelance editor and indexer and is writing a biography of the 15th century English Queen Elizabeth Woodville for Routledge. Her talk today is titled La Belle Inconnue, Medievalist Fabrications in 19th Century France. Take it away, Kavita.
Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen, and if you give me a moment, I can get this started. I do want to offer a quick disclaimer, which is that this is actually part of a much, much larger project. So if it seems like there are pieces missing, that's because there are pieces missing. So apologies in advance for that. Among the many medieval tomb effigies in the Abbey of Saint-Denis, just north of Paris, is that of a queen or a princess whose name has been lost to history. Restricted to royalty, aristocracy, and the wealthy middle class, tomb effigies carry symbols, clues, and interpretive choices that reflect not only the person being represented, but also their family, dynasty, nationality, political allegiance, and place in society. This particular effigy is carved from Carboniferous limestone, known at the time as Tournai stone, and dates from the late 13th to early 14th century, with an unusual costume and effects that have been compounded by later restoration work. Attempts to determine her identity through archival study have proven inconclusive due to the displacement of many royal and aristocratic tombs following the 1789 revolution. A subset of the effigies formerly attached to these tombs found a final home in Saint-Denis during the reign of Louis XVIII, when the abbey was reopened as not just a royal necropolis, but as a museum devoted to medieval and early modern tomb sculpture. What stands out most to me about this effigy, which I call the Inconnue, or the Unknown Lady, is her elusiveness. For the medievalist, she is an unusual and beautiful work of art. Her anonymity and the paucity of records offer the opportunity to speculate on her identity and the cultural forces surrounding her creation. From a curatorial and museological perspective, however, her afterlife is a cautionary tale that intersects with several volatile and controversial figures in 19th century France, all of whom were instrumental in promoting what we would now call medievalism. The Inconnue thus offers an intriguing case study as a manifestation of one medieval woman's legacy, overlain by the reinterpretation and reinscriptions of later writers, artists, curators, and historians of art. Her first potential identity, proposed by Alexandre Lenoir in 1806, is Blanche de Castille, mother of Louis IX of France, a lady famed for her piety and for her successful regency while her son led the Seventh Crusade. Lenoir's historical fantasy places the effigy in a beautiful, if wholly fabricated, neo-Gothic chapel, similar to the more famous one he created for Abelard and Héloïse that still stands today. In 1848, Ferdinand de Guillermy, one of three antiquarians in charge of the restoration of Saint-Denis, used the Inconnue as an example of Lenoir's poor curatorial practice. Calling attention to the effigy's unconventional costume and crown, Guillermy identified her as Catherine de Courtenay, titular Empress of Constantinople, who died in 1307. For the next century, scholars dismissed Lenoir and upheld Guillermy's identification until Françoise Baronne, curator of medieval sculpture at the Louvre, wrote the definitive study of the Inconnue in 1969. For today's purposes, I'm going to focus on the earlier half of this history. If you're interested in the full version, I do intend to submit it for publication sooner rather than later. The Inconnue is a recumbent gisant-style effigy that, including the slab, measures approximately 6.5 feet in length, 4.8 feet in width, and 3 feet in height. Beneath the young woman's head is a small, simple pillow carved from the same piece of black tournaille stone. Her feet rest upon a stylized pair of what appear to be wyverns, as opposed to the four-legged dragon. These only have 2 legs. And she wears a crown studded with carved jewels and topped with elaborate fleurons or ornamental flowers. Her wavy hair is loose beneath a short veil. The costume is simple, a side-slit surcoat with bell sleeves over a longer kirtle. Both the right side slit and the right sleeve are edged with fur. The other sleeve and slit are bare. Her gloved hands are pressed together in prayer, and she wears a small ring on the 4th finger of her right hand. Her face is of idealized proportions, very serene, and her eyes are open. There are signs of restoration work, as you can see, on the nose, the chin, the hands, and the crown is showing signs of ongoing restoration work, as you can see in the 2 sets of photographs, one in 2004 and one in 2011. There are bits and pieces missing. The rest of the tomb does not survive, nor are there any identifying marks or other decorations on the slab. The Inconnue and other tombs in Saint-Denis today owe their survival to the dedication and persistence of artists and academics based in Paris in the 1790s. Among these was Alexandre Lenoir, who tirelessly worked to preserve tomb sculpture as a historical resource in spite of its royalist and aristocratic associations. From 1791 onward, certain works of art that had belonged to the royal family, members of the aristocracy, and the church were removed from their original locations and placed in a depot at the former convent of the Petits Augustins. By the end of 1795, Lenoir's depot housed approximately 200 marble sculptures, 350 marble columns and fragments, and over 2,000 paintings, mostly from churches in or near Paris. Most of the paintings and sculptures ended up in the Louvre, which ironically opened its doors as a museum just a few days before looters pillaged Saint-Denis in the name of the Republic. But from approximately 1795 to 1816, the depot at the Petits Augustins was open to the public as the Musée des Monuments Français, the Museum of French Monuments. The concept of a public museum had developed in the 18th century, so there was little to no curatorial tradition for Lenoir to follow. Instead, he hoped to inspire in his visitors not just intellectual, but emotional reactions to the historical artifacts on display. And it was for this reason that he organized the musée into a series of what we would now call period rooms. It is worth remembering that Alexandre Lenoir had no training in conservation or art history. He was a gifted amateur with a talent for imaginative storytelling. As such, though he deserves full credit for his role in the preservation of medieval art in France, his methods, like many of his fellow medievalist romantics, leave something to be desired. In his Elysium Garden, for instance, Lenoir used fragments from Saint-Denis that matched the style of the 12th century to create a chapel dedicated to Peter Abelard and Héloïse of the Paraclete. Not based on any real tomb, this fabrique, now installed in the Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris, was a fantasia on the medieval, in keeping with the reburial of the bodies at the insistence of Empress Josephine. Abelard and Héloïse, who had both been initially buried at their respective religious institutions after long and distinguished careers, now lie side by side, remembered less for their individual accomplishments than for the love story that later readers made of their lives, one of the many narratives foregrounded by the peculiar aesthetic and curatorial choices of Alexandre Lenoir. The earliest reference to a black marble statue of Blanche de Castille does not appear until the 5th volume of Lenoir's expanded catalogue. The entry describes not the effigy alone, but the full fabrique, the Chapelle sépulcrale de la Reine Blanche, which Lenoir claims to have saved from the ruins of the Abbey of Maubuisson, where they were being sold for materials and restored. Blanche de Castille, who ruled as regent for her son, both when he was young and when he went on crusade, had also founded Maubuisson, where she died and was buried in 1252. The abbey had been suppressed in 1787, and many of its buildings, including the abbey church, were destroyed after the Revolution. Although the Inconnue is not included in the final inventory from Maubuisson, there is mention of a sale on the 26th of September, 1793, by the director of the Pontoise district of a black marble figure on a slab to one of Lenoir's agents. With just enough evidence to back up his claim, Lenoir was able to highlight the chapel belonging to the celebrated mother of Saint Louis, the only French monarch to be canonized by the Catholic Church, as a monument of unquestionable historical importance. This status is further demonstrated by the fabrique's placement not alongside its contemporaries in the 13th century hall, but in the expansive barrel-vaulted 17th century church of the Petits Augustins. His narrative goal to, in Alexandre Stara's words, create a representation of France that remained relevant and meaningful for the whole nation and its people throughout history, regardless of contingencies, was far better served by a chapel dedicated to the queenly mother of a sainted king, even if Lenoir needed to embroider upon, and to some extent fabricate, the evidence to get there. While there exists an account of a purchase in 1255 of a piece of Tournai stone intended for a tomb for Blanche, all references to Blanche's actual tomb at Maubuisson specify that it was made of metal, either copper or bronze, and that the queen is depicted wearing the habit of the Cistercian nuns. The Tournai stone, therefore, was likely used as the slab with a layer of copper depicting Blanche in relief. Sadly, no drawings of this tomb survive, and it was melted down for canon in the 1790s, like all of the other metal tombs in Maubuisson. A drawing does survive of a statue of Blanche in the 18th century collection of Rogier de Gagnères that, aside from the missing crown, echoes the descriptions of her tomb. This statue also appears in Bernard de Montfaucon's Catalogue of French Royal Monuments, published between 1729 and 1733, with an accompanying engraving. But neither of these pre-revolution images resembles the Inconnue. In 1848, some 30 years after Lenoir's musée closed and his collection of tomb effigies was transferred to the reconsecrated Saint-Denis, Baron Ferdinand de Guillermy took issue with several of Lenoir's identifications of tombs that had been on display at the musée. One of these was the purported Blanche de Castille, who Guillermy recast as Catherine de Courtenay, titular Empress of Constantinople. Catherine was also the second wife of Charles de Valois, the younger brother of Philip IV of France, whose plans to retake Constantinople fizzled around the time of Catherine's death in 1307. Guillermy's main supporting evidence was the Inconnue's unusual costume and crown, both of which can be explained by Catherine's hereditary title, though she never set foot in Constantinople herself. He also points to a single reference from 1764 to a black marble a tomb of black marble at Maubuisson that belonged to Catherine de Courtenay. A travel journal written around 1640 also mentions a tomb made of black marble bearing a statue of a crowned woman also made of black marble in the church at Maubuisson, but does not identify the woman to whom the tomb belongs, only that it is definitely not that of Blanche de Castille, whose tomb is described later as very beautiful and, I am told, made of bronze. Guillermy's primary purpose in drawing attention to the Inconnue was to disprove Lenoir, with whom he had a long-standing feud, and who he claimed had created a Queen Blanche out of Catherine's effigy. Indeed, the popularity of the musée, partly stemming from its unusual organization, inspired historians and antiquarians to come out publicly against Lenoir, and this trend has continued to this day. As such, the correct identity of the Inconnue mattered less to Guillermy than the fact that Lenoir was wrong, and his theory proves to be almost, if not quite as shaky as Lenoir's original. The main objection is the multiple contemporary accounts of Catherine's burial in the Valois chapel at the convent of the Jacobins in Paris. Indeed, it was immediately after her funeral that King Philip IV had the Grand Master of the Knights Templar arrested for treason. In 1792, Louis Aubin Milin described the tombs in the Valois chapel before the convent was destroyed and mentions Catherine having been buried in either a joint tomb with her husband, who died some 20 years later, or directly adjacent to him. Guillermy argues that within a common tradition of the time, Catherine may have had a secondary tomb at Maubuisson. He does not try to claim that the Inconnu came from anywhere else, although he identifies other tombs that came to Saint-Denis from the Jacobins, including that of Catherine's husband, Charles de Valois. Lenoir's popularity outside of academic circles meant that, despite being disproven, both his theory for the Inconnu's identity and Guillermy's remained in circulation for the rest of the 19th century and a good part of the 20th. Indeed, Antoine Etex used the Inconnu as a basis for his sculpture of Blanche de Castilla in the gallery at Versailles in 1837. And we can also see a similar version in the Jardin de Luxembourg, which is itself based on the Versailles sculpture. This error was brought to Etex's embarrassed attention some years later, and the result was a bust, clearly based on the Inconnu, but now specifically named Catherine de Courtenay. Much like the dissolution of the monasteries following the English Reformation, the French Revolution had a devastating impact on the survival of medieval art, born of the contrary desires, on the one hand, to obliterate the past in pursuit of a regenerated society, and on the other, to preserve past monuments as evidence of Republican enlightenment. These paired impulses also led to the creation of the Musée des Monuments Français, and finally to the reconsecration of Saint-Denis as a historical repository for the pre-revolutionary monarchy. The story of the Inconnu could be the story of any tomb in Saint-Denis, but hers carries the strange confluence of mysterious provenance and stylistic peculiarity. To the woman who commissioned her, she was a memorial, a representation of a life most probably spanning across the Mediterranean to France. To Alexandre Lenoir, she was a highlight of his career, a famed queen of France whose tomb was one of the most popular attractions at his museum. And to those who came after Lenoir, she was a way to tear him down, to overturn his vision of engaging directly with history by pointing out his own inaccuracies. Now she is just another tomb in Saint-Denis, and perhaps we would do better than to imagine unquiet slumbers for those monuments who have finally found peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kavita, for a fascinating talk and fabulous visuals. Very enjoyable, thank you. I'd now like to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Katie Garner is a senior lecturer in 19th century literature at the University of St. Andrews. She is the author of Romantic Women Writers and Arthurian Legend, The Quest for Knowledge, and co-edited with Nicholas Rowe, John Keats, and Romantic Scotland. She is currently working on a book on Romantic women poets and the sea. Her paper today is titled Transnational Medievalisms and the Mermaid. Take it away, Katie.
Can you see my slides okay, Vanessa?
Yes, they're perfect.
Great. Thank you very much. And that was fantastic, Kavita. Brilliant. So I'm going to talk a bit about transnationalism and the mermaid. So every culture across the globe has its own version of the mermaid. From the Nigerian Mamuwata and the Japanese Ningo to the Irish Mero and the Russian Rusalka, the Scandinavian Havfru or Hasfru, the mermaid and her kin swim in cultural waters all across the globe. It's a racially diverse group of beings that contrasts then with the succession of white, pale, half women, half fish that appear in 19th century paintings and designs by William Hilton, Edward Burne-Jones, Evelyn de Morgan, and John William Waterhouse. Perhaps it was the art of the 19th century then that helped to give the artists at Disney the idea that Ariel should be a redhead. The release of the Disney live-action version of The Little Mermaid earlier this year, starring Halle Bailey as Ariel, ignited the prejudices of many social media users who took to Twitter to air their racist convictions that mermaids couldn't possibly be black. And several prominent medievalists on Twitter or medieval accounts forcefully countered such claims by posting numerous examples of black, blue, and all colours of mermaids and mermen that were imagined by medieval illuminators. The backlash against the black Ariel then suggested that the white mermaids of the 19th century might have quite a lot to answer for. And I want to suggest then that we might draw a parallel between the arrival of Disney's Black Mermaid on our screens in 2023 and another potentially equally revealing moment in the mermaid's cultural life 201 years earlier. In 1822, a mermaid arrived in London surrounded by a particularly slick marketing campaign, including what you could perhaps imagine as the romantic equivalent of the movie trailer, a letter likely written for publication that appeared to confirm her authenticity, and an illustration by none other than George Cruikshank. Put on display by a Bostonian ship captain and placed in the room of a London coffee house for viewing, she travelled a long way to get there. The mermaid, it was said, was caught somewhere on the north of China by a fisherman, brought to Batavia, the Dutch East Indies, and purchased there and taken thereafter to London. The expected fact or fiction debates ensued, but a large part of the media coverage reprinted the same potted history of recorded mermaid sightings through the ages. And these started to appear in the 1780s, prompted by the display of previous purported mermaid bodies. The range of evidence was insistently global. Mermaids had been spotted in the Morea, in Ceylon, in Copenhagen, in Mozambique, in Holland, in Poland, in Brazil, and in India. This was a history that revealed the endeavours of diverse fishermen, mariners, and explorers spread across the face of the globe, but who were strangely united in their unexpected encounter with a mermaid, either as part of their daily business in their local environment, or during an exceptional voyage to an unfamiliar part of the world. It was a history that went back to the Middle Ages, and two medieval accounts are always mentioned in these kind of potted histories. The first is the tale of the Wildman of Orford in Sussex, recorded in the 12th century chronicle of Ralph of Coggeshall. And this was generally presented as evidence of the first mermaid to be discovered on the English coast. And Ralph describes how in 1187, a group of fishermen caught a man in their nets one day and brought him back to the castle and imprisoned him so that he could not return to the water, which he clearly wished to do. The wild man or merman ate fish, which he squeezed with his hands before eating. He didn't speak, and eventually he escaped his captors and returned to the sea from where he came. And Ralph is unsure what to make of this strange story and concludes that it's impossible to know whether he was a mortal man or some fish in human form or a wicked spirit lurking in the body of a drowned man. The second medieval story dates from the 15th century, and it relates a quite similar instance in Edam in Holland. This time the merperson is female, and they're discovered in the mud and slime of a field of cows after it's been flooded by a violent storm. This mermaid more successfully integrates into Dutch society, learning to spin and apparently gaining some understanding of religion, but retaining the same fascination with water seen in Ralph of Coggeshall's Wild Man. So 19th century audiences then knew that the mermaid had a history that extended as far back as the medieval period. Some examples emanated from England, but the general effect of these potted histories was to emphasize the similarities in the sightings and strange features and behaviors that had been observed in the various encounters with sea people from across the globe. In one 1761 account of a merman seen off the coast of Martinique, the witnesses were jointly enslaved Africans and a group of Frenchmen. And illustrations of various mermen and women, several purportedly drawn whilst the specimens were still alive, also suggested a global population of mermaids who were racially diverse. One commentator in the Gentleman's Magazine took this as evidence then for two distinct genera, or properly species of the same genus, one resembling the African blacks, the other the European whites. The scientific question of whether mermaids were real or not raised a number of possibilities about a possible global mer population, as diverse perhaps as those known on land. The discussions of the racialized features of various mermaid bodies recorded in these kinds of illustrations are characterized by typical 19th century prejudices, which I won't repeat here. However, the succession of mermaid bodies that came under scrutiny towards the end of the 18th century and in the 2 decades of the 19th forced commentators to consider how the object labeled mermaid in front of them might be reconciled with their poetical or literary impression of a mermaid with long flowing golden hair, white, with a comb and a mirror. The 1822 mermaid shown in London was eventually subjected to a full scientific autopsy, which revealed that it was formed of the body of a monkey sewed to the tail of a salmon. Thereafter, no further mermaids visiting London raised the same interest from the public in the same way, and the conversation shifted away from questions of authenticity and towards interest in the mermaid's literary history. In 1832, as part of a 10-page discussion on the sirens and mermaids of the poets, Leigh Hunt drew attention to Chaucer's reference to mermaids in the Romance of the Rose, which he positioned as a natural continuation from the discussion of sirens by classical writers. Mermaid poems by Tennyson and Matthew Arnold appeared from the 1830s onwards, and they, of course, became popular subjects for depiction by Burne-Jones and Waterhouse and other visual artists. But another key development that helped to make the mermaid seem a specifically medieval being was the 18th century ballad revival. The mermaid of the ballad tradition is a capricious and beautiful trickster, delighting in snaring unsuspecting men who cannot resist their beauty and song. Matthew Lewis included one of the best-known mermaid ballads, Clark Colville, in his collection of supernatural ballads, Tales of Wonder, from 1802. And here the mermaid curses Clark Colville with a continual headache until his death. Before he can stab the mermaid with his knife, she vanishes to a fish and disappears into the water. John Leyden's The Mermaid, a self-confessed imitation of an ancient ballad, published in Scott's Minstrelsy of the Scottish Borders, bears evidence, I think, of some cross-fertilization between the mermaids in the press and those of literary tradition. Leyden writes a long headnote to his poem that addresses the supposed existence of these marine people, as well as examples of mermaids in medieval romance. He acknowledges that the mermaid is a figure of universal tradition, or perhaps, in other words, transnational. But ballad conventions mean that his mermaid is whiter than white. She has a light pearly skin, whiter than the downy spray, and glossy yellow ringlets. She's formed from the mermaids he's read about in Norwegian accounts, though he proposes that her comb and mirror are probably, he says, of Celtic invention. After Leyden, various writers, including John Pinkerton, Alan Cunningham, and others, published mermaid ballads which they presented as if taken from tradition, but which were later discovered to be modern originals. These false mermaids set out to ensnare their lovers and generally succeeded, but often the plots seem secondary to the mermaid's performed charms. Her long golden hair and her pearly skin lingered over in multiple stanzas that often seem addressed to the male gaze. Both Cunningham's The Mermaid of Galloway and Leyden's The Mermaid are insistently local poems in which the mermaid is a product of her immediate environment, brought into being by either, in Leyden's case, a particularly dangerous whirlpool in the Western Islands of Scotland, or the green Mersey side of the Solway in Galloway. So there are two strands that flow alongside one another and surround the mermaid in the first decades of the 19th century. Both are underpinned what we would recognize as a medievalizing impulse. The consistent reprinting and circulation of the tales of the 12th century merman of Orford and the 15th century merwoman of Haarlem or Edam in Holland establish a medieval history for mermaid sightings. And the revived strains of ancient ballads, excavated from an ancient and vaguely medievalized past, reintroduce the pearly-skinned and golden-haired mermaids of literary legend. But there is also much there that is invention, a pattern of conscious national or Celtic creation that might seem insularly opposed to the global history of mermaid sightings circulating at exactly the same time. A transnational approach to the 19th century rise of the mermaid ensures that we don't lose sight of either. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie. That was a fantastic talk. And I especially appreciated the connections that you made at the beginning with contemporary discourse. These discussions are still very relevant. Hopefully we can chat about that a bit more in the Q&A. So I'd like to now introduce our third speaker, Dr. Jonathan Shu. He's professor of English at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., where he is also affiliated faculty in Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies in the Seeger Center for Asian Studies. Shu is the author of Anti-Racist Medievalisms, From Yellow Peril to Black Lives Matter, and he is co-founder of Global Chaucers and founding member of the research and mentorship network Race Before Race. His articles on medievalism have appeared in PMLA and Postmedieval, and he has an article forthcoming on medievalism and disability in the Journal of American Ethnic History. Jonathan's paper today is titled, or Shu's paper today is titled, Solidarity Across Disciplines, Medievalism Studies, and Ethnic Studies. Whenever you're ready.
Oh, did I get this right? All right, just the test. Are people able to see and hear me? Okay.
All good.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this invitation, Vanessa, to speak on this roundtable on bars. I'm going to pick up some of these themes on transnational approaches to medievalism, as well as constructions of race and the so-called monochrome myth about so-called monochrome Middle Ages. I'm interested in, I presented much of this work on race and medievalism to fellow medievalists, but not yet to a 19th centuryist audience. So I hope we can have more of these crossovers. I also want to just acknowledge that, for those of us who are teaching on college campuses right now, it is a very difficult time geopolitically for people who are Arab, Jewish, Muslim, Palestinian, but I am taking hope in new forms of interfaith solidarity and movements towards peace and justice we see on a global scale. So it's that ethos that I want to bring into this talk. I'm speaking to you now from, yes, okay. I'm speaking to you now from Washington, D.C., by the way, which is the traditional homelands of the Piscataway and Anacostan peoples. I want to consider how medievalism studies can actually join forces with ethnic studies. This is a field that owes its origins to student activism and a third world solidarity protest against imperialism and settler colonialism around the globe. This presentation is drawing upon my work, my most recent book, as mentioned before, Anti-Racist Medievalisms, From Yellow Peril to Black Lives Matter. This book is engaging with Asian American studies and Black studies, examining how ethnic minority authors embrace medieval storytelling to advance racial justice. So how do early 19th century Black, Asian, and multiracial authors teach us something about medievalism and social justice? So I'll focus on three authors here. One is Frederick Douglass, the iconic African-American abolitionist and orator. The second is Wang Qinfu, who is a Chinese-American activist and public speaker. And the third is Sui Fa, who is a biracial Chinese and English journalist and fiction writer, all born and writing in the 19th century. So a little bit of a background for this work in the 19th century, in 19th century ethnic studies. My historical context for this is actually yellow peril, or anti-Asian racism. This is a set of stereotypes that circulated in majority white Anglophone societies, such as the UK and US, that cast Chinese and Asians more generally as a social and moral threat. So in the UK, Australia, US, Chinese were dehumanized as so-called rat eaters, heathens, opium addicts, threats to white labor. Chinatowns were associated with things like disease and corruption. So throughout North America, Canada, US, and Mexico, militant groups such as the Knights of Labor organized anti-Chinese riots and massacres. So it is in this particular context where medievalism is aligned with white supremacy that we can actually focus on ethnic minority writers critiquing anti-Asian racism and building multiracial solidarity in response. So let's think a little bit about one of these first authors, Frederick Douglass. So as most people, I think, would know, he was a famous African-American abolitionist born in slavery and public speaker. This is his home in Washington, D.C., a quintessential Black Victorian home in Anacostia, now a national historical site. In his book, The Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself in 1847, Douglass recounts his experience of racial violence and enacted upon enslaved Black men and Black women, and its corrupting force on white slaveholders, men and women alike. Medievalism comes into this picture as when he achieved freedom, he adopted the new name Douglass from the works of Walter Scott, the name by which he would be known. This creative repurposing of 19th century modes of medievalism and chivalric brotherhood are a motif in his work. After the Civil War, he gave this speech, Our Composite Nationality, in 1869, that resonates today, suggesting a broad coalition of Americans who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color, arguing step by step that we need to rebuke unequal systems of citizenship under the condition of white supremacy. He notes that the Indian, that is Indigenous or Native American, and the Negro, that is the Black or African American, has not been treated as part of the national body politic. That is, for a long time, Black people were enslaved, not eligible for citizenship, and neither were Native Americans. After the Civil War, a new race, that is Chinese Americans, Chinese immigrants, are claiming attention. He rebukes the hypocrisy of Irish Americans, that is our Celtic brothers, evoking 19th century ideas of chivalric brotherhood and saying that they're not standing up for the weak and the defenseless, as honorable men should, but rather they are targeting the vulnerable Chinese and forming associations in avowed hostility. It is in this context that he actually envisions Chinese integration into US society through citizenship, voting, office holding, a composite nationality of people of all origins, Indian and Celt, Negro and Saxon, Mongolian and Caucasian, Jew and Gentile. He also says that this has got to be a new world where citizenship rights are expanded in all directions, right? Okay, so I'll move on to a contemporary writer, that is Wang Qinfu, Chinese American, who is a contemporary of Douglass and carries over these 19th century modes of rethinking chivalric brotherhood and collectivity. He was the first Chinese American to use that term as a political term. He published a newspaper called The Chinese American in Chinese and English, including the flags of both countries. printed in 1883. He used journalism, visual art, and literature to counter yellow peril stereotypes. So one of his key strategies was humor, often using chivalry against toxic white masculinity. Dennis Kearney, here, a picture on the right, was an Irish American who was infamous for inciting violence against the Chinese, using the slogan, Chinese must go. Wang here, pictured on the left, challenged Kearney to a duel, saying, I would give him a choice of chopsticks, Irish potatoes, or Krupp guns. Now, the choice of Irish potatoes among weapon choices denotes Kearney's own immigrant status. Wang also references Kearney's career as of inciting armed violence through appeals to agreed white masculinity. Now, as a journalist, Wang debunked yellow peril propaganda, and he also did this in his fiction. In the 1880s, he wrote the historical serialized novel Wu Zhi-Tian, the Celestial Empress, inspired by medieval Chinese romance of the Three Kingdoms. His novels then offered Asian-inspired counterparts to Sir Walter Scott, European historical romances like Ivanhoe, and Twain's Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court. Through such storytelling, Wang created alternatives for readers to accept Asians as real chivalric heroes and as lead characters. So Wang used both journalism and fiction as counter storytelling. In his political treatises, he did this as well. I'll just signal that a collectively authored work attributed to the Americanized Chinese in Chicago invoked and amplified this discourse of brotherhood, saying that Chinese Americans want the glories and responsibilities of full citizenship, and they also envision joining forces with our colored brethren, that is African Americans, to sit and eat at the national family table. So in thinking about these modes of cross-racial solidarity, there's more of this in my book, is Chinese and Jewish American solidarity, as well as Arab Americans who are writing in the earlier 20th century about the complex racialization of Arab immigrants in the US. But I'll now just turn to our final author, that is Susan Farr, who was known by her Cantonese Chinese name, Susan Farr, meaning water lily. She was born Edith Maud Eaton to a Chinese English family. In this photo, she's a well-to-do young lady who could be perceived as white. She has dark hair and eyes and holds a book. Her short story collection, Mrs. Spring Fragrance, offered sympathetic accounts of Chinatown life in US and Canada, and her essay Leaves from the Mental Portfolio of a Eurasian reflects on her own biracial identity and experiences of racism and misogyny in 4 countries. Now, it is in this text, the mental portfolio, that she really thinks about the implication of medievalism and white supremacy. When she is little, she learns, as a proper English schoolgirl does, that China is a heathen country that is being civilized by England. When she moves to Jamaica with her family, she's disturbed by the casual anti-Black racism of English colonizers, and she learns to identify more with the brown people of the earth. When she's in Canada, a naval officer objectifies her as a nice little body, saying that I will tell you about all the sweet Chinese girls I met in Hong Kong, and she rejects his advances. So it is in this context where Susan Farr repurposes chivalry for a Eurasian female subjectivity. When she's verbally assaulted with her brother on the streets of the US, she's taunted along with her brother with anti-Chinese epithets, which I will not read here, such as Chinaman, Yellowface, etc. And she decides to fight back. With her brother, she says, quote, "The white blood in our veins fights valiantly for the Chinese half of us." And this response is narrated as a callback, as a as a way of responding to a racial microaggression and verbal harassment. In this mode of self-description, she casts herself as the white savior, and also the imperiled Chinese person. That is, she's both the victim and the active bystander. Insofar as Susan Farr is biracial, that is, she has a white self and a Chinese half, she draws upon her capacity to pass as white in certain contexts in order for her political advantage. There's a journalistic essay that she writes later in her life in Toronto, where she implicitly presents herself as an white English woman, as EE or Edith Eaton, and she advocates for the for Chinese communities on behalf to her white Canadian allies. So that is an essay that is called "A Plea for the Chinaman," a correspondence argument in his favor. She invokes the white Anglophone discourses of domesticity and white saviorism in order to make an appeal for the full humanity of Chinese immigrants, and claims a insider status along with an ethnographic understanding of the full humanity of Chinatown life. So I'm going to think about more broadly of kind of what these early ethnic minority writers can do to help us understand medievalism in the context of 19th century ethnic studies. So anti-Asian racism, for instance, is nothing new, but neither is the idea of racial justice. So 19th century ethnic American writers can tell us that anti-racist activism has a long history, and medievalism can be a part of that. The second idea is that BIPOC, or Black, Indigenous, and People of Color coalitions, are powerful, and they have been so before we had the idea of those categories, whether it's BIPOC, Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, however you want to call that, collectivity, that people who are racialized in those groups can find ways to act in coalition with one another. The third idea is just that creative works, literature, journalism, visual art, can be activist media. Medievalism, medieval studies, has its origins in philology and nationalist forms implicated in white supremacy and colonialism. But if we put medievalism in the context of ethnic studies, we can create a different lineage, right? So my conclusion then is this, that medievalism studies in any historical period needs to engage reciprocally with ethnic studies, as it's known in North America, as well as migration studies, as it's known in the UK and Europe. Collectivities such as Bigger Six in 19th century studies, the Black Victorians contingent, should all join forces with medievalism studies, such as Matthew Vernon's work on the Black Middle Ages, Kavita's work along with Helen Young on global medievalism, and Li Wang, an important scholar on comparative racialization in the 19th century. I hope that we can create more venues for this sort of cross-disciplinary dialogue. Whether we are in history, in art history, in archaeology, whether we are on either side of the Atlantic, in Asia or beyond, I hope we can continue to create these new horizons for solidarity and for collective action. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for a wonderful, thought-provoking piece and for that forward-thinking concluding message. I'd now like to introduce our final speaker today. Bryant White is currently serving as Assistant Professor of French at Covenant College in Lookout Mountain, Georgia. Brian is also a PhD candidate in French at Vanderbilt University and is working to finish up a dissertation on the development of religious parody throughout the Middle Ages, looking especially at its proliferation in several genres of late medieval secular drama in France, including farce, sauté, and sermons joyeux. Additionally, he has both presented and published research on the use of medievalisms in colonial and post-colonial contexts. context. In this connection, he's been a featured interviewee on the Multicultural Middle Ages podcast. Bryant's presentation today is titled Law, Literature, and Monstrous Medievalisms, Edmund Picard and Colonialism in the Congo. Whenever you're ready, Bryant.
I don't apparently see Bryant on the call, Vanessa, so he may have dropped connection briefly. We'll let him in as soon as he rejoins, but maybe you want to take some questions in the meantime?
Kavita, I actually think had a question for Katie in the chat. Kavita, would you like me to read that aloud for you, or would you like to share it yourself?
I mean, I could share it myself. That's not a problem. So the question is that I loved this discussion that you had of medieval mermaids and their reinvention in the 19th century. I'm very curious about how the French legend of Mélusine fits into these medieval discourses. She's associated not with the sea, but with fountains. And she's only sometimes described as a mermaid, but she's kind of folded into this tradition in weird ways. And I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit. That's a great question. Thank you very much, Rita. Letitia Elizabeth Landon in the 1830s does write a poem called The Fairy of the Fountains. So she's clearly found reference to Mélusine and is interested in kind of rewriting her story. It's not, Mélusine doesn't tend to come up in earlier kind of literary references to mermaids before about the 1830s. The big question, I suppose, is what brings it into British and poetic discussions at that point. Off the top of my head, I can't remember whether we know which source she used for that particular poem where she found the French legend. So it is there, but it only really seems to come into view a little bit later. There is overlap, I guess, with Keats's Lamia and other similar poems that are a bit earlier than that seem to have kind of Mélusine-like elements. But I think Mélusine is more of a Victorian mermaid context than it is a strictly romantic one. I mean, Landon is one of those interesting figures, and she that sits on the kind of border between romantic and Victorian taste. But yeah, she certainly knows about it and does write a poem about it that really focuses very much, as I recall, on the relationship between Mélusine and her mother.
Thank you so much. That's a lot of things for me to look at.
Other questions for Katie, Kavita, and Jonathan? You can either use the Q&A function or the raise hand. I see there's one in the Q&A forum. Let's see. There's two questions for Dr. Garner. How much would the figure of the siren have influenced the conception of the mermaid in the 18th and 19th centuries? And is it during medieval times that we first see a fascination with mermaids? And they thank you for your fascinating presentation.
Thank you. Yes, the siren background is definitely there. Leigh Hunt's piece on the mermaids and sirens of the poet spends a lot of time with the sirens. Probably the first half of that essay is really about representations of sirens. So yeah, the idea of the mermaid's kind of classical heritage is certainly something that's known. It's a kind of another strand, I guess, that fits alongside the mermaid in the medieval ballads. And I suppose what I was also sketching out as mermaid sightings as a place where medieval material is also used. So yes, there is an understanding of the relationship between sirens, nymphs, mermaids that are circulating around. Yeah, what's interesting, I suppose, is there's a disconnection Oh, Brian, you're back.
Yeah,
Sorry.
so I don't know what, I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened. I got kicked off the network and everything was down there for about 5 minutes or so at the end of
Oh,
Jonathan's talk, but now I'm back.
yeah.
I apologize.
Oh, no problem at all. The technology is always an issue, but Katie was just answering a Q&A question. No, we'll go ahead and come back.
Oh, sure.
Perfect. So Bryant, whenever you're ready, go ahead
Okay.
and take it away. You
All
missed
right,
your
I'll go ahead.
introduction, but it was there.
Okay. Okay, thank you. All right, I'll go ahead and share my screen here. Let's see. Okay, can everyone see that?
All good.
Okay, well, I just want to thank the British Association of Romantic Studies for hosting this event, and to Vanessa for organizing and moderating, and for the invitation to speak here about my work. It's a real honor and delight to speak with you all and to hear the other scholars. And I'm particularly excited about Jonathan's work because I think there's a lot of connections with some of the concerns and questions that I'm interested in. And the work that I'm presenting here is really sort of the combination of two articles that I published within the past year. One that was specifically on the person and work of Edmond Picard, who is sort of the subject of this talk. And that article is entitled Edmond Picard and the Congo Free State, a Study in Law and Literature, and was published in the online journal Humanities in February of this year. And the second article is a little bit more directly related to the topic of medievalisms, and that is entitled Cynocéphale, Abuses of a Medieval Trope in Several French Texts of the Modern Era, and was published in the journal The Year's Work in Medievalism over the summer. So sort of touching on those two, and if you want a little bit more detail and context for this, those would be good places to learn more. Now, the reason that I find Edmond Picard to be such an important figure is that he really does sit at the crossroads of law and literature at the end of the 19th century, in the period of some of the worst, most atrocious acts of colonialism. He's a figure with a foot in each of those worlds. Picard is a virulent racist capable of expressing that racism with great ferocity in the text that he writes of a more literary nature, and this ties into the idea of monstrous medievalisms that I'll get to in a moment. But he's also influential in the realm of law and is therefore capable of transposing his racist ideology into real-world legal effects that have consequences for human lives on the African continent. And so first of all, just to give a brief summary of Picard's life and influence, he's born in 1836 in Brussels, Belgium. As a young man, he goes to law school and begins practicing law, quickly rising to the top among his peers. The scholar Bart Copain argues that in the Belgian legal world, he is no doubt the most brilliant and most omnipresent figure of the second half of the 19th century. He goes on to author a number of texts that express a judicial philosophy that is profoundly racialized in character. He also views history as essentially an inevitable clash between racial and ethnic groups, and law has a role to play in that. Law is the expression of a particular ethnic or racial group. Now, where theory meets practice comes in 1892 when Picard is called upon by King Leopold II of Belgium to provide legal counsel on Leopold's annexation of the Congo, essentially as his own private property, and entitled the Congo Free State. And it is certainly one of the most horrendous acts of colonialism ever committed. Some estimates give a number of 10 million deaths as a result of the atrocities committed in the Congo under King Leopold. In this context, Picard argues for applying the concept of terra nullius, or in the French, terre vacante, vacant land, to the Congo, such that Leopold can claim both sovereignty and property ownership of the land because it's deemed to have no owner because it's uncultivated land. And I think what's important to note here is the fact that Picard weaves a narrative going all the way back to the Middle Ages until the present time and seeks to place Leopold's actions within the context of that narrative. He argues that earlier forms of colonialism confused property and sovereignty, trampling on the rights of individuals to own property within occupied territory. He contends that the General Act of the Berlin Conference of 1885 represents a gold standard of progress that allows for respect of particular persons under occupation. He also argues that Leopold's actions are within the broad stream of humanitarianism and compare favorably against other European nations, saying that what Leopold is doing is taking vacant land in order to cultivate it on behalf of the indigenous peoples in Africa. He concludes with this statement: "The historical account that we have just given demonstrates clearly that the principle of attributing vacant land to the state's domain, subject to the acquisition of rights, far from constituting an anomaly, is on the contrary in keeping with the most humanitarian measures that up until now have been applied in the appropriation of colonial land." Now, what this consultation of Picard's fails to take into account is that there could be any such thing as communal rights to property. Picard is looking clearly through a Western individualistic lens in his understanding of property ownership, one that does not fit with African understandings of property as more communal. So in this account, cultivation of land is a sign of individual ownership. Since the land is not cultivated by European definitions, it is therefore not owned by any one individual, and therefore it is subject to terra nullius standards and can be annexed by Leopold. So what I want to point out before moving on from here is that even in this text, Picard engages in some light forms of medievalism as he places Leopold's actions in the context of a narrative that goes all the way back to the Middle Ages. But I should also note that he treats the medieval period in a very superficial way, making sort of broad generalizations and claims, referencing the enslavement of the Slavic peoples, for example, the Islamic conquest of North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula, describing all of these as terrible and inhumane, and then contending that what is happening in Africa, and specifically in the Congo under Leopold, is much more humane. Incidentally, one of Leopold's sort of justifications in going into the Congo was that he wanted to abolish the slave trade in that part of Africa. So now if we turn to Picard in the realm of literature, it's important to point out that at the same time as he was a prominent legal figure and jurist, he was also known for supporting a burgeoning literary movement in Belgium and founded the literary periodical L'Art Moderne. He was a committed socialist and believed in art that was socially engaged over against the proponents of art for art's sake. And Picard also held to a literary theory that was profoundly nationalistic, believing that art should express the soul of a nation and a people group. And his views on literature are really of a piece with this overarching philosophy of history as a clash of peoples and of races. Now, what I have argued is that Picard's own literary output gives expression to his overarching ideology as well as the actual effects of his legal output. It is all mutually reinforcing, and medievalism plays a strong role in that. This comes to the fore in Picard's 1896 travel narrative, En Congolais, in which he describes a journey beginning from the west coast of Africa toward the so-called Congo Free State, King Leopold's Congo. The most striking moment in the text, from my perspective, is when Picard is aboard a ship with a large group of West Africans and describes them with reference to the cynocephali, or dog-headed people, which, although arising as a feature of travel literature as early as antiquity, becomes a near ubiquitous trope of this genre in the Middle Ages. And this passage is quite horrible and dehumanizing. I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but if you take a look at it, you can see the references to cynocephali and also to anthropophagy as well, cannibalism. So here, both the references to those two things throw us back to medieval views of the monstrous races, as both of those are monstrous races that were categorized and classified in examples of medieval travel literature. And John Bloch Friedman has so helpfully analyzed this in his work, The Monstrous Races in Medieval Art and Thought, and others such as Deborah Higgs Strickland has also done wonderful scholarship on this, demonstrating that these monstrous races represent a medieval form of dehumanizing othering that is especially present in the context of medieval travel literature. Now, although Picard in context is specifically referring to a group of West Africans that he sees on board the ship, it becomes clear throughout the text that he sees little difference amongst various groups of Africans. And so he could easily apply the same sorts of descriptions to the Congolese that he encounters once he arrives in the Congo. In addition, Picard clearly situates himself in continuity with the medieval tradition of travel narratives, as he will go on later in the text to compare himself to St. Brendan and parallel his own experience to that of the strange wonders recounted along St. Brendan's voyage, which also features cynocephali, thereby exoticizing and othering the African continent through allusions to medieval mirabilia. And just to demonstrate that this kind of reference is not merely a one-off in the French tradition of travel narratives, in my article, I also look at two other texts that make reference to cynocephali as a manner to sort of frame what Picard's doing. The first is Jules Verne's 1863 travel narrative, Cinq Semaines en Ballon. And here you can see an example of some medieval art depicting the cynocephali, or dog-headed people. But this text by Verne, Cinq Semaines en Ballon, is about three characters taking a hot air balloon journey from East Africa to the continent's west coast. In one scene, two of the main characters, Joe and Kennedy, have just returned from hunting when they spy a group of Africans running toward them in the distance. They first refer to the group as singe, the French word for apes, and then as cynocephali. Later on in the text, it becomes clearer that perhaps a medieval reference to monstrous races and cynocephali is in view. Commenting on the many groups inhabiting this region of Africa, Kennedy says that a number of scattered tribes come under the general title of nyam-nyams, and this noun is nothing less than an onomatopoeia. It reproduces the sound of chewing. And if you read through this, again, I'm not going to read through this whole exchange, but if you read through this, you can see that there are references, once again, both to cannibalism, to anthropophagy, and also to the cynocephali, the dog-headed people. At the very end, Kennedy says that we must relegate all that to the realm of fables, just like the dog's heads of the traveler Brun Roulet attributed to certain tribes. And then Joe responds with dog's heads, that's convenient for barking and even for man-eating. What's unfortunately been proven true is the ferocity of these populations for the human flesh they seek. What's so striking here is that we see cynocephali and anthropophagy, those two tropes of medieval travel literature, conjoined once again in a way that parallels what we find in Picard. The conjunction of cynocephali with anthropophagy again harks back to the medieval period. David Gordon White, in his work Myths of the Dog Man, discerns the origin of this association in medieval retellings of the Alexander romance. And though I've never been able to find a specific reference to Verne's work in Picard, I'm quite certain that Picard would have read him, because he seems just simply to have read all the literary output of his time. Importantly, this passage in Verne contains at once a denial of the cynocephal fable, quote unquote, while also recognizing that such stories existed well into the 19th century and were spread even by European travelers. Despite the denial of this myth and its literal meaning, its symbolic signification is kept intact. The notion that the head, the seat of the intellect and reason, has been replaced by baser instincts and animal passions. And so there's a question about the true humanity of the indigenous peoples. This sort of reading and debate about the cynocephali goes all the way back to the Middle Ages, with writers like Augustine, St. Thomas of Cantimpré, and Ratramnus debating their ontological status. Carl Steele, in his book, How to Make a Human, notes that the zoocephalic monsters in general tend to have this symbolic layer to them among the medieval writers, tending to symbolize, quote, the upright, rational, bipedal form of the human, governed by animal lusts and thus made morally monstrous. Now, lastly, in my article that appeared in the year's work in medievalism, I provide another later example of the cynocephali in a Belgian comic book, Zozo Explorateur, which demonstrates, I believe, the continuation of this trope. In Zozo Explorateur, which came out in 1934, the titular character crash lands upon an island inhabited by a myriad of different creatures, including a tribe of cynocephali who have rather dog-like facial features and are depicted anthropomorphically as human-animal hybrids. Moreover, the cynocephali engage in a ferocious attack upon Zozo, the titular character, which is mirrored by an equally ferocious attack of the island natives, who are depicted animalistically with dark skin. And I don't think that it's coincidental that they look very much like the types of stereotypical Africans one finds in other comic books, such as Tintin and the Congo. But this paralleling of the cynocephali with the indigenous peoples completes the transfer of animalistic attributes to the natives. So in conclusion, what's the point of all this? What's the takeaway that we can have as scholars of medievalisms? Well, I frame my article with both an introduction and conclusion that places within the context of more recent appropriations of medievalism toward racist or white supremacist ends. And here, the specific example I give is of the way that medieval iconography and slogans were used by white supremacists in the march that turned deadly here in the US in Charlottesville, Virginia, back in 2017. And for more on these kinds of uses and appropriations, I would highlight the excellent work done by Amy Kaufman and Paul Sturtevant in The Devil's Historians, How Modern Extremists Abuse the Medieval Past from 2020. I think we also need to pay attention to the work of scholars like Geraldine Hang in her Invention of Race in the European Middle Ages to see that othering and what she calls race making don't magically disappear the further we go back into the past. In other words, Picard and others are pulling on these medieval tropes because they are so effective at othering and can so easily be conscriptive in service to racist ends. And what Picard does in the realm of literature gives expression to and reinforces the worldview that enables his legal work to be effective and to have real world consequences in the lives of so many. So what I say at the end of my article, and I'll just conclude with this, there is no pre-modern age of innocence. A medieval world without race making is just as much a fantasy as the all-white Middle Ages dreamed of by the alt-right. If we allow medieval race-making tropes to be conscripted for modern racist ends, as they were by Verne, Picard, and Franchi, who's the illustrator and writer of the Zozo comic series, rather than engaging in critique of those tropes, then we endanger all attempts at, to quote Sharon Kinoshita, deprovincializing the Middle Ages and undermine the work to establish more global and inclusive medievalisms. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bryant, for that interesting and impactful discussion. We already whetted your appetite a little with the start of a Q&A session. We're going to resume now. Before I turn to the raising hand function and the Q&A forum, I just wanted to return to Katie's answer. Did you want to add anything to the question that was posed about the conception of the mermaid in the 18th and 19th century and the origin of mermaid fascination, Katie, or did you get to sufficiently answer that question, do you think?
Thank you, Vanessa. That's really generous of you to come back to me at this point. I think I might have slightly forgotten the second half of that person's question. The first part was about sirens, and the second part was
perfectly fair. Let me restate it. They asked, is it during medieval times that we first see a fascination with mermaids?
Yeah. Is it during medieval times? I suppose, yeah, you've answered your own question there. So the classic kind of the relationship of the classical siren to the mermaid is always a kind of very difficult one to untangle from the classical siren, who could be both bird-like or indeed snake-like or indeed fish-like, and then becomes kind of transformed into the medieval mermaid of the margins of manuscripts, which I guess is, you know, now how many of us kind of maybe first see images of medieval mermaids in kind of various forms. Yeah, I suppose I've been interested in this question of when do mermaids start being seen as predominantly medieval and not as classical? Is it part of a kind of broader Gothic, you know, rise of the Gothic? It probably is that, you know, it's kind of the impetus of that, a slight move away from the classical into the Gothic. But they're forever kind of entangled. And so the way in which the kind of the literary history of the mermaid first becomes being formulated in some of these head notes to the ballads, where mermaids do lots of very kind of things that were reminiscent of medieval texts, but are also being countered by kind of literary histories which do want to, I mean, in that piece by Leigh Hunt on the mermaids and sirens of the poets, I just think that's such an interesting piece, because he's trying to kind of bring the both together at once. He spends an awful lot of time on the classical, as you would expect, I suppose, any writer to do. And his only real medieval example is Chaucer and the Romance of the Rose. And then he moves on really to early modern examples, to Milton and to other things. So there's certainly not, you know, that's mid 1830s. There's not a kind of understanding there that there might be lots of mermaids in medieval texts. But there certainly is an understanding, I think, in people like Tennyson, that mermaids provide medieval flavour in works like The Idylls of the King and others. So they definitely become kind of part of that conversation.
Thank you so much for answering the question, Dr. Garner. That provided a lot of food for thought.
No problem. Thank you very much for asking it, Ruksha.
Thank you.
Other questions? Feel free to use the raise hand function or to type your question in the Q&A forum. Well, I am more than happy to jump in with my question. So you all are pushing medievalism studies forward in part through your transnationally focused frameworks. And so, or at least I think so. So I'd like to ask you if you could, this is for all of you, if you could speak a little more about maybe the potential for using these transnational frameworks, where you could see medievalism studies moving forward, or just even what the significance of using these frameworks are, especially when we think about contemporary relevance that a number of you have already spoken to some extent as already.
Well, I guess I could just start if you don't mind. I think for me, I think an interesting question for me as somebody who's not a 19th centuryist is actually how I find, in working on medievalism by early authors of color, is that they break the rules of our literary historiography, right? We don't have these fault lines of romantics versus Victorians. We have to create a different kind of literary history to say that, well, we can have early ethnic minority writing before those categories of identity even existed, right? So I think there's ways that by attending to a different context for discussing medievalism, we get to ask new questions about our preconceived knowledge of how 19th century studies should be configured, right? So for me, that is one of the things that I find really interesting. I find myself talking more with 19th century studies folks in ethnic studies because that's makes more sense to me than talking with, say, Victorianists, right? So I think that's kind of something I've been trying to think about.
Thank you, Jonathan. So opening up kind of larger scale reconceptualizations. Fascinating.
I think I would just, sort of echo what Jonathan said, and I mean, the fact that medieval studies itself is so sort of bound up, right? The origins of medieval studies is sort of bound up with the rise of nationalism and these sort of attempts. I'm thinking specifically of the French context, these attempts to sort of valorize medieval figures as proto-French, people that can become sort of emblems of French national identity. And so a sort of a transnational approach can sort of push back against that and blur some of these artificial boundary lines that have been created over time. And also, I also think it can show us, it can also sort of push back against, barriers created by time as well. I mean, one of the things that I'm trying to demonstrate is that, the medieval past has the things that we are concerned about today have relevance, and we can trace them back to the medieval past. And so they have to transcend this whole narrative that is bound up with like sort of national identity and all of that. And also, I mean, one of the things that I was really seeking to do in my work early on was to find sort of positive, more contemporary, positive, writers who are pushing back against some of these medievalist tropes. And I'm still looking for that. I mean, that's something I'm still interested in. But I think a transnational framework can help us not just sort of focus on these individual tropes, but also look for ways to respond to them and critique them. And not allow them to become sort of fixed as promoters of nationalism and white supremacy.
I think that if you don't mind, I think this is where kind of Jonathan's evocation of counter storytelling comes into play, because I think that is one of the ways that it is possible to push back against a lot of these assumptions. And partly it's kind of the use of creative transformations, because I mean, at the end of the day, if it's a good story, people will read it. So it's a matter of finding the right narrative and kind of pushing it and using it to subvert the narratives that are already there. And I think that's what a lot of people who work on medievalism today are doing. It's not enough to just say, okay, this is inaccurate. You have to take that next step and say, okay, that's inaccurate, but let's come up with a version that is more accurate, more interesting, more nuanced, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I think what I found really fascinating about your paper, Bryant, was that I think, I realized that lots of the things I've worked on that have been, in my work on medievalism have been to do with conscious medievalism, by writers who are somehow performing their engagement with the medieval. That's definitely what my work has kind of looked at in the past, for traces of how they encountered the medieval world and the ways in which contemporary politics, might have influenced that. But Bryant, I think that reading of Picard's inheritance of racist tropes, it's, I think, and I think you've written about this, Kavita, in Global Medievalism, is the way we're moving away from those, potentially still canon forming ideas about what the medieval is to thinking about the inherent ways in which medievalism underpins all aspects of literary performance, from style to, the use of chivalric tropes that might be unconsciously performed by groups across the globe. And I do think that's really important work, and it's also really exciting work to do.
I think just one thing to add for it, Kavita, I really loved your paper. I don't know anything about this figure, so I learned so much. I think something that I also drew from this is that you're dealing a lot with, cultural fantasy of the medieval and its relationship to nationalism. Your work with art and archaeology shows that this kind of national formation, fantasy of national formation, is an architecture, right? It's all about a social infrastructure that you are creating. You're actually building it, right? So I think that, or destroying it, right? So I think there is that kind of your real engagement with art and archaeology is also a really important aspect of this. We can't just be talking about literature. We tend to only talk about literature and visual art. I think you're really making this three-dimensional, and you're saying that we really need to think more broadly about how, the nation state and nationalism needs to be broken open in so many ways. So that's something that an insight I take from your presentation.
Well, thank you. No, it's the museology and curatorial elements that I was working with are a relatively recent addition. I only kind of started looking into that maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And partly it was actually kind of a happy accident. I was staying in Montreal, and the Center for Canadian Architecture actually has the biggest collection of documents related to Alexandre Lenoir in the world. I still don't entirely know how they got them, but I was there and I was able to look at so much of the material, like the original blueprints, the print, like the images. There were so many people who were creating images of the Musée des Monuments Français. And it was a complete phenomenon. Like Napoleon went there, Michelet went there, Alexandre Dumas Père went there, like all of the big writers. Victor Hugo went there. Like Notre Dame de Paris was at least partly inspired by the medieval rooms in this museum. So we're talking about kind of the giants of French 19th century medievalism, who are all being influenced by this space. And this space, that was a very temporary space. Like it only existed from 1795 to 1816, and that was it. Everything just got scattered after that. So it's a very kind of ephemeral thing as well. But you can see its influence just branching out throughout the 19th century. And I fell into that rabbit hole, and I don't know what to do now.
Thank you all so much for those contributions. I think we can have one more question if we want to push the time just a little. Matt, go ahead.
Okay, if no one else has anything. I wonder whether you could speak a little bit to the sort of the particular power of medievalism for driving these sort of narratives. And I was wondering whether this had something to do with the extent to which the medieval has already been pre-edited in some ways, so that it's already been sort of winnowed down to particularized tropes. I was thinking of the desire to make that tomb for Eloise and Abelard, so a particular set of figures, and the sort of particular potency of the mermaid, of the dog-faced creature as things. So I was wondering whether you could speak to why the medieval tropes seem to be particularly sort of powerful for going back to in these 18th and 19th century context, and what that has to do with this sort of shapedness of the period already coming into this point, and how that plays into some of the phenomena you're discussing.
I mean, if you don't mind me starting off, partly I think it's because in the 18th century, first of all, we're starting to see the academic study of the medieval, of the early modern. And also, I think it's partly because so many of these sort of philosophical figures, literary figures, are trying to define themselves against the medieval. They're trying to say, we are not medieval. The medieval is the Dark Ages. The medieval was scary. It was Gothic. It was dramatic. It was all of these things. And it was very interesting. But we are now in the Age of Enlightenment. We are now past that. We have moved beyond the medieval. So I think what we're getting is a combination of nostalgia and kind of self-definition in opposition to what the medieval was.
Yeah, I would just agree with what Kavita has said. I think that's always the double bind when we're dealing with medievalism, right? The Middle Ages is always the other, the complete other, the it symbolizes the alterity to modernity of whatever, you know what I'm saying? Alterity and modernity. It's a thing that should be utterly rejected, and yet it's also needs to be claimed as the foundation of national traditions. I think for me, on the transnational framework, I think it's interesting for me how ethnic minority writers who already have a problematic status when it comes to being inside and outside of the nation state are already prepared to think about those dynamics, right? So someone like Susan Parr, he is the English colonizer class. He comes from England to Jamaica, right? He also knows what it's like to be Chinese and to be racialized as such, right? So I think that's something that accessing some of these early ethnic minority writers, just as medievalism is starting to kind of take shape, I think they are more flexible with what they can do with it. I think because they don't have they don't fit the script to begin with, right? So that's kind of how I see things.
Yeah, I guess maybe, those kind of mermaid narratives are an example of a space where that kind of dark and kind of brutal medieval Middle Ages versus the modern Enlightened age doesn't really exist. In those kind of accounts of people who have been confused by encounters with sea people, they're all kind of equally bemusing and strange, and none of them are really explained or rationalized. Strangely, I suppose, in that Ralph of Coggeshall story, actually there was some torturing of the wild man when he was found that was involved, but actually that's not repeated in those narratives. There's no attempt to set off a kind of brutal Middle Ages against a kind of modern mermaid encounters as somehow more easily to scientifically kind of understand. So there's definitely a kind of a parallel there. I think another way is in the story of editing, as Kavita was kind of saying, that medieval encounters with the medieval were often partial in terms of what texts were reproduced, sometimes texts in fragmentary form, incomplete form. And so then, of course, images were distilled and kind of distilled further in the kind of tradition of that. I guess I'm thinking really mainly back to my work on women writers and the King and the Arthurian legend, and about the kind of Bowdlerized ways in which they encountered various aspects of the legend, and then of course went in a different direction because they were given a different text in the first place. But I think there was also probably on the literary side an impression that romance was too big and unwieldy. You know, the kind of this idea that romance was full of lots of artful things, but that those needed to be broken down in order to be appreciated. I mean, that's the Tennysonian method, I suppose, that he really nailed and continued. You could be a great admirer of medieval texts and romances like Tennyson was, but you also believe that they needed to be sorted out and they needed to be isolated in order to achieve their kind of artistic potential. I don't know if other people would agree with that.
I would say in the case of Picard, I think I find that the medieval references and allusion make just kind of an effective shorthand for him. So when he references Saint Brendan and Saint Brendan's voyage, he's really trying to inscribe himself in this grand tradition of literary travel narratives and hearkening back to that. So that just makes an effective shorthand for him. And then the references to cynocephali and all of that, again, his readers, especially, most of the people reading Picard would be, this very well-read, educated public that he's sort of catering to, these other writers and poets that he's sort of mentoring. And so they would likely have tapped into these references as well and known immediately what he was doing there. So I find that in his other writings, his more theoretical writings, he doesn't talk that much about the Middle Ages specifically as a period, but he does sort of he'll reference these medieval texts and authors quite frequently, and just throw them together with the other sort of grand names of the French literary tradition. And so he doesn't seem to have. He seems to be. He doesn't seem to think of the Middle Ages as a dark age, but one that he can sort of pull on to give himself and what he's doing, more prestige and easily sort of telegraph to his audience what he's doing.
Thank you all so much. Sorry to cut the discussion short a little, but we're brushing up on time now. But you all did just brought such fascinating work, and we're so lucky to get to hear from you all. Jonathan said about moving forward, thinking more broadly, and all of you, I think, really helped us do that. So thank you so much to our speakers for all of your contributions. Fantastic work. And thank you all for joining us as well, audience members.
Can I just thank Vanessa for all of her work curating and organizing this event? It's been wonderful. Thanks to all the speakers. Thanks to everyone again on behalf of BARS. Check out our call for papers. Check out another call for further digital events. If you would like to do digital events, we are always open to suggestions, but we are specifically open to suggestions in about 2 or 3 weeks once we publish the next call. So do send stuff through. Thanks everyone. Hope you have a lovely evening or afternoon or morning, depending on where you are.